Well, hello APUSHers, this is Mr. Rains, and in today's video, we are going to be looking at Period 3, 1754 to 1800, from the French and Indian War through the Adams presidency. That's a lot of ground to cover. Are you ready? Well, let's get started. For today's story of significance, I'm going to be highlighting the man himself, the greatest, the best, yes, of course, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was born in the Caribbean to a single mother. He would later become an orphan. Yet he worked hard, got a good education, and at the age of 17, he came to the 13 colonies. Hamilton supported the cause of the Patriots. He fought in the Revolutionary War. And after the war, Alexander Hamilton was appointed as Washington's Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton became the founder of the nation's financial system, the capitalist system that we know today. He was also the founder of the nation's first political party, the Federalist Party. Now, is there anything Hamilton didn't do? Yeah, he didn't become the president because, unfortunately, Hamilton would die an untimely death. He was challenged to a duel by Vice President Aaron Burr in 1804, where Hamilton was shot and killed. Good thing they created a highly acclaimed musical about Hamilton, because he is our story of significance. So let's move on to Roman numeral 1, the French and Indian War. Now, as you might remember from Period 1, England was not the only European country to send settlers to America. France had built numerous forts and settlements in America and established friendly trade relationships with Native American groups. As the years progressed, the English worried about France expanding, especially in the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes region. This dispute over land would ultimately lead to the French and Indian War, and it would drag the colonies into a 9-year conflict. Now, in this war, the Native Americans tended to side with France. That's why it's called the French and Indian War. The Iroquois Indians would be the only tribe to side with the English during the war. The first shots of this war would take place at Fort Necessity, an English fort that was quickly constructed by an American colonist whom you might have heard of, George Washington. Old George would one day lead us to victory in the Revolutionary War, but in his lifetime, he would actually lose way more battles than he would win. Washington and his men were forced to surrender This marked the start of the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is also known as the 7 Years' War, because of course the war lasted, no joke, 9 years. History and math, I guess, aren't friends. More significantly than the war itself is the changing relationship that would develop between the colonies and the British. Some will even argue that the French and Indian War, a war where the colonists fought alongside the British, is actually one of the main causes of the future Revolutionary War. But we will talk more about that later in the lesson. Here is a good illustration of the two different forts. Fort Duquesne was a highly fortified French fort compared to, in this picture below, Fort Necessity, the English fort constructed by George Washington himself. Now again, one of the incredible things that will come from this conflict is how it begins to unite Americans. For years, as the 13 colonies were being settled and developed, they grew into very distinct areas. So if you lived in Virginia, for example, you had very little in common with someone who lived in, say, Massachusetts. Therefore, you would consider your colony, in a sense, to be your country, and there was little opportunity or desire to unite. However, to fight this French and Indian War, leaders from the various colonies came together at the Albany Congress. The goal of the Albany Congress was to establish colonial unity for the effort to help England win the war against the French and the Indians. It was at this meeting that Benjamin Franklin, an amazing American colonist, produced the picture of the severed snake with the phrase, "Join or die." I'm sure you've probably seen this illustration before. The point was quite clear. A snake that is united is lethal, just as the colonies, if united, could defeat their common enemy of France. Well, ultimately, unity from the Albany Congress was not achieved, but this event is still noteworthy as the first significant attempt at American unity. Spoiler alert here, eventually the colonies will come together against an enemy, but that enemy won't be France. Stay tuned for period 4 to hear how that story ends. Now the English and its American colonies would win the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris 1763 would end the war and would solidify England's control of the land. France retained only the city of New Orleans, plus some unsettled lands west of the Mississippi. England's dominance was secured in America. So the war was obviously significant for the victory, but it also brought a number of other changes, most notably the changes in relationship between the England and its American colonies. Their relationship after the French and Indian War would never be the same again. In the war, the American colonists gained confidence in their own ability to fight and to be a strong military. Some even began to question their need for British military protection. They felt they could handle this on their own. They also began to lose their confidence that they had once had in British invincibility, because they witnessed firsthand the British make foolish decisions on the battlefront, and it was clear they weren't the dream team they had once thought that they were. During this war, the colonists had also viewed the British as their brothers. Of course, they were all Englishmen. Yet the British displayed little respect for the colonists throughout the entire war, limiting their rank in the military and separating themselves as much as possible. The American colonists instead discovered that they have way more in common with each other than they would with the British, and this begins the road toward colonial unity. In addition, the high cost of the French and Indian War would cause England to feel that the Americans needed to pay more. Therefore, you could say the French and Indian War is the mark of the end of salutary neglect, and it'll usher in a period of rebellion and conflict between the colonists and the British. Here is a map that shows you the territorial gains of the English from the French and Indian War. Here is a good example of stimulus-based multiple choice question on the French and Indian War. Now, I would encourage you to go back through the PowerPoint. You'll see a number of stimulus-based multiple choice questions. Work through those questions. Because remember, the more practice you have with these, the better you're going to get. Now let's look at Roman numeral 2, native response. Following the French and Indian War, not only had the French lost the war, but so had their Native American allies. Left alone, native chief Pontiac organized tribes in a desperate attempt to fight back. We know this as Pontiac's Rebellion. Unfortunately, the Native Americans were not nearly powerful enough to defeat the English. And like so many other times in American history, it won't end well for the natives. In an infamous incident during this conflict, the English distributed blankets to the Native Americans that had been exposed to the smallpox disease. The plan succeeded in breeding a deadly smallpox epidemic among the Indians. This is an early form of biological warfare, and it defied traditional rules of war as it targeted women, children, and the elderly. To prevent further conflict with Native Americans, which proved to be costly for the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. To many American colonists, they felt like they were being denied their spoils of war that they had helped to win. The Americans felt these restrictions were unfair and an abuse of power that they were not used to experiencing. This map shows you the proclamation line. Many redcoats were stationed along the border to prevent Americans from crossing. To make matters worse, the Americans had to pay for these soldiers to be there, and were even forced to house them while they were there. Now, Roman numeral 3, growing desire for freedom. The French and Indian War will be the first step towards the Revolutionary War. But why would the colonies ever want to leave England? Why would they desire independence? Where did this mindset come from? England was arguably the most powerful nation in the world at the time, and the colonies benefited from that power and wealth. Unlike other European colonies in America, the English colonies experienced relative freedom and autonomy for many years. The best examples of this are in evidences of self-government, like the House of Burgesses in Virginia, or the Mayflower Compact in Massachusetts. But I like to use the potato chip analogy. We all love potato chips. If you don't, you got a problem. But if you've never tasted a potato chip, you probably wouldn't ever get a craving for potato chips. But if someone were to be nice and to give you one chip, or maybe even 2 chips, that might actually be worse than giving you none, because 1 chip or even 2 chips wouldn't satisfy you. It would only make you want to have more. The same is true for the colonies. They were given a taste of self-government, but it would only produce in them a desire for more. And when they felt like England was trying to assert its authority, the American colonists would display signs of bitterness and rebellion. They would want the whole bag of chips. Here is my cartoon depiction of the potato chip analogy. You see the King George III, is offering opportunities for self-government in the Americas. 2 good examples of this, of course, would be the House of Burgesses, the Mayflower Compact. The colonists had a taste of self-government. But after tasting this, they would only want more. And because of this, they would eventually fight for complete self-government, or separation from England, independence from England. This would begin the road to the Revolutionary War. Hope you liked my cartoon. Roman numeral 4, financial reasons. With the end of salutary neglect, the colonies witnessed freedom slowly taken away. For England, they began to view the American colonies in a parental way. England was the mother country, and the colonies were the children. The term for this is mercantilism. Under the system of mercantilism, the colonies existed for the financial benefit of England, the mother country. Of course, this would be very beneficial for England. The 13 colonies were a source of great profit and power. But England would certainly argue that mercantilism was also very beneficial to the colonies, because the colonies benefited from the most powerful military in the world protecting them. Benjamin Franklin viewed it this way. Listen to his words. "We have an old mother that peevish is grown. She snubs us like children that scarce walk alone. She forgets we're grown up and have sense of our own." I think that aptly puts the situation of the colonies in England during this time period. Now, in the American colonies, taxes were not unheard of. The colonists had paid taxes for many years, but generally these were local taxes imposed on them from the colonies themselves. They felt like these taxes were fair taxes because they knew and approved of them. England, however, felt the American colonies had not been paying their fair share, especially after the huge cost associated with the French and Indian War. So England began to enforce numerous new taxes upon the colonies after the war, including the Revenue Act, also known as the Sugar Act, which also was a means to crack down on smugglers. The Stamp Act was even worse. This was a direct tax on all printed materials. Playing cards, marriage certificates, any official paper had to have the stamp. To many, this was an unacceptable intrusion on their day-to-day life. For the most part, though, these taxes could be easily evaded in the colonies, but some, especially in Boston, felt that even the attempt at imposing these new taxes was a slap in the face. Outspoken critics of the British included the infamous Samuel Adams, who would start the revolutionary protest group, the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were radical and sometimes even violent, and they did not represent the majority opinion of the colonies. The Sons of Liberty were not opposed to taxes in general, but felt like the Americans should have a say-so in what was being taxed. Their motto became, "No taxation without representation." The Sons of Liberty encouraged boycotts of British goods, and at the time 40% of British goods were purchased in the colonies, so this of course would certainly garner attention from the British government. Eventually there would be taxes on practically every item, including tea, which was the most offensive since it represented the shared British culture of the American colonists and Englishmen. To make sure that the Americans were paying these taxes and not smuggling in goods from other countries, the British government gave redcoats writs of assistance or search warrants, which allowed them to search Americans' homes and property for smuggled goods. Besides the Sons of Liberty, there were others who were growing discontented by these taxes and abuses of power. In the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, Americans were encouraged to resist the British and these new taxes. Rather than relent, though, the British sent redcoats to Boston to continue to enforce the new rules and taxes, and there began a power struggle between the colonies and the British government. Here is an excerpt I want to read to you from Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. If at length it becomes undoubted that an inveterate resolution is formed to annihilate the liberties of the governed, the English history affords frequent examples of resistance by force. What particular circumstances will in any future case justify such resistance can never be ascertained till they happen. Perhaps it may be allowable to say generally that it can never be justifiable until the people are fully convinced that any further submission will be destructive to their happiness. Here is an illustration of the Sons of Liberty tarring and feathering a tax collector. Of course, like I mentioned, the Sons of Liberty were considered a radical, sometimes violent protest group. On to Roman numeral 5, events in Boston. The most radical events leading up to the Revolutionary War would always seem to happen in the city of Boston. Much of the anger would stem from the fact that the Americans began to feel like their rights were being denied. You might recall we discussed the influence of the Enlightenment on American thought. Ideas such as natural rights had been growing in America, and now they were being tested. The unwanted redcoats were given permission to stay in American homes under the Quartering Act. And in Boston, the tension continued to rise to a boiling point. In a notable incident, a group of American protesters began heckling a group of redcoats and throwing snowballs and oyster shells at them. One of the redcoat soldiers tripped, and the others responded by firing on the unarmed crowd of Americans. In total, 5 American colonists were killed in this event. The soldiers' actions were unacceptable, and a trial was set. And an early example of an American democratic ideal in practice, an American lawyer named John Adams, a future president, agreed to represent the redcoats in court, because he said He believed that everyone should have the right to a fair trial. This is an important theme that will carry over into our foundational documents. This event became known as the Boston Massacre, which is kind of odd since only 5 Americans were killed. But the Sons of Liberty used this phrase as a form of propaganda to get the word out about British abuses of power. After this event, patriots in the various colonies began to set up a systematic means of communication known as the Committees of Correspondence, where letters could be written to report on any actions committed by the British, and this information could be quickly spread throughout all the colonies. Here are a couple more examples of stimulus-based multiple choice questions. These questions are not based on written stimulus, but on drawings. And of course, on the AP exam, you could see a lot of different types of stimulus used. I would encourage you, go back and see if you can answer these questions. The boycotts against British goods finally worked to convince the British Parliament to remove many of the taxes. However, in a move many seen as offensive, the tea tax remained. In many colonial harbors, tea ships were simply turned away. But in Boston, of course, the governor had ordered that the ships be permitted to dock. The Sons of Liberty were convinced that purchasing tea would be a traitorous action. John Hancock himself claimed that anyone who supported the Tea Act was an enemy of America. So, in a notorious scene, members of the Sons of Liberty dressed as Indians and boarded the tea ships and dumped the merchandise into the Boston harbor. 342 cases of tea were thrown into the harbor, costing the British company thousands of dollars. This, of course, is known as the Boston Tea Party. Now, King George III of England called this an act of rebellion, and Parliament passed the Coercive Acts as punishment on Boston. The colonists, though, would never refer to them as the Coercive Acts. Instead, they were known as the Intolerable Acts. The punishments included Boston Harbor would be closed. The people of Boston were forced to pay for the damages of the Boston Tea Party, and town meetings in Boston would be banned. Now, the other colonies would get word of this, and they were concerned about the actions in Boston, and they called for a meeting of colonial leaders known as the Continental Congress, which was held in Philadelphia. The colonial perspectives could not have been more different. Most, however, wanted to remain loyal to England. Few were ready to even consider the prospect of war. They did acknowledge, though, that if one colony was attacked, that could be considered an act of war. Patrick Henry famously went back and said, "Give me liberty or give me death," one of my favorite quotes from American history, because to him, freedom was worth fighting for. Roman numeral 6, Lexington and Concord. In Massachusetts, they were preparing for a potential fight. In the city of Concord, the colonists had stockpiled weapons. In case something were to happen, then they would be prepared. The British, however, got word of the supply of weapons and intended to raid it. To prevent this, the Americans lined up in the city of Lexington, blocking the British route. At Lexington, someone fired a shot. It's still debated who, but that shot is often referred to as the shot heard round the world, as it was the start of the Revolutionary War. The Americans in this war would be vastly outnumbered. And to most, the Americans were very unlikely to win. Here is a map showing you Paul Revere's famous route, where he warned the Minutemen to wake up and be prepared. Roman numeral 7, the Second Continental Congress. After Lexington, colonial leaders met again at the Second Continental Congress. Again, they were very divided about what to do. A good example of the differing views that were present would be that of John Adams from Boston, who wanted a declaration of war because, of course, he was living through the most dramatic scenes. And then you have someone like John Dickinson, a Quaker from Pennsylvania, who wanted peace and hoped that war could be avoided at all cost. The Continental Congress, though, did finally come to some decisions. They would form a Continental Army, made up of soldiers from all 13 colonies. However, they would also draft an olive branch petition, which would be sent to the king as a last attempt at peace. The motto, "No taxation without representation," would be a rallying cry for the Americans. However, England claimed that the colonies had always had representation, virtual representation, and that they didn't understand why the Americans were so upset in the first place. The English claimed that there was someone in the British Parliament that represented the American colonies. However, this person wasn't chosen by the Americans, and that is why they felt unrepresented. The Continental Congress, though, also agreed to eventually draft the Declaration of Independence. The main author, of course, would be Thomas Jefferson. This document could best be described as the breakup letter with England. And finally, the Continental Congress would choose George Washington to be the leader of the Continental Army. He was known by all to be a man of high moral character, but there were also political reasons for his choice. He was highly regarded for his service in the French and Indian War, but he was also from Virginia, the largest of all the colonies. And of course, he was the tallest man in the room. So who else would you choose? James Madison? I think not. Roman numeral 8, common sense. Throughout the war, there would remain many Americans who would be loyalist. That is because loyalty to the king was ingrained in America. It was part of the culture and British heritage. Meals would end with "God save the king." So how could you go out and fight against him? That meant, unfortunately, colonial unity was poor. And Washington would not only have to fight against the British, but also against his own countrymen. In an attempt to motivate more to support the war, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he said it only makes common sense to stop following the royal brute, King George III. To some, these words were sacrilegious, but to others, they were written in such basic language that could easily be understandable, and they were effective in inspiring support for the patriot cause. Now let's look at some of the reasonings that Thomas Paine gave in Common Sense for supporting the war cause. Things like, it is ridiculous for an island to rule a continent. America was not a British nation. It was composed of influences and people from all over Europe. 3. Even if Britain was the mother country of America, that made her actions all the more horrendous, for no mother would harm her children. Or this one, being a part of Britain would drag America into unnecessary European wars. 5. The distance between the two nations made governing the colonies from England very difficult. And also, Britain ruled the colonies for its own benefit, remember, mercantilism, and did not consider the best interest of the colonists. Pretty simple reasons that motivated many to support the patriot cause. Roman numeral 9, declaring independence. Remember, it would be Thomas Jefferson that would be the main author of the Declaration of Independence. This document is a foundational U.S. document, but it was never intended to establish a form of government. Rather, it is more the breakup letter with England. It will state the reasons why the colonies wanted independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. A king is not greater than citizens. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Everyone is given rights by God. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Doesn't that sound a lot like Locke? The document would finally be approved on July 4th, 1776, the day we now celebrate as Independence Day. After the Declaration of Independence is signed, it would be too late to apologize for King George III. Here is a famous picture of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and some of the famous people that were there to sign it. Roman numeral 10. Who is included? The Declaration of Independence is a foundational document that declares that all men are created equal, a lofty democratic ideal. Equality sounds good, but throughout our history we have tried to figure out who exactly is included in the all men are created equal. Were women intended to be included? Abigail Adams, the wife of one of the delegates, wrote frequently to her husband words like this: I long to hear that you have declared independence. I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them. And women participated in the war efforts in numerous different ways. A notable example is Deborah Sampson, who dressed up as a man in order to fight in battle. And while the men were away fighting, the women were active in raising the family and taking care of the home. The idea of Republican motherhood began to form. Women were seen as the primary caretakers of America's future. This was considered a huge responsibility that deserved respect. Therefore, it was believed that women should be educated. Now, this would be a revolutionary idea in and of itself, that women deserve the right to an education. The reason? It would be an effort to pass on moral values and citizenship to each new generation. In a way, this said that women should be respected in a society. And in a sense, this is a form of progress for women's rights. Obviously, women would still have a long way to go, but this was a step in the right direction. But for now, women were still not included, and the all men are created equal. Well, what about African Americans? Are they included in all men are created equal? Well, initially there was a provision against slavery included in the rough draft of the Declaration of Independence, but it was removed in an effort to avoid conflict among the differing colonies. Slavery, therefore, would remain and would ultimately divide our country in many ways. However, many African Americans would serve bravely in the Revolutionary War, hoping that they were fighting for freedom, that they would be included eventually in the all men are created equal phrase. Well, what about the poor and the uneducated? Unfortunately, most early laws prohibited the poor from participating in democracy. Land ownership was a requirement for voting. If you were poor or uneducated, you would have no voice. So the Declaration of Independence promoted a democratic ideal of equality, but it would take many years to work out the details to include more and more people. Roman numeral 11 is the American victory. Against all odds, the American colonies would come out victorious against the most powerful country in the world, England. It was a David versus Goliath story, and David won. But why did the Americans win? Well, geography played an important part. The Americans were fighting on American soil. They were very familiar with the land. The Americans also had a strong patriotic spirit. The Americans were fighting for their very freedom and homes. However, the Americans could not have won without the help from abroad. We can credit, in a large part, this to Benjamin Franklin for negotiating with the French to get them to send supplies and ultimately troops to our aid. We were indebted to the French for helping us bring victory against England. In the Treaty of Paris, 1783, the Revolutionary War would officially be ended. Yes, you heard that right. 2 treaties of Parises. Treaty of Paris 1763 ended the French and Indian War, and the Treaty of Paris 1783 ended the Revolutionary War. In this treaty, England officially recognized the U.S. as an independent country, but starting a new country would be nearly as difficult as winning the war itself. This map will show you the first United States territory, 1783. Roman numeral 12, a new government. Following the war, it was unclear how will these new states govern themselves. The first United States Constitution was called the Articles of Confederation. Americans viewed the central government as bad, and that too much power centralized was not something anyone in America wanted. The solution then was federalism. Under federalism, power is divided among the central government and the 13 states, where most power would remain with the states themselves. Because of this, the new government under the Articles of Confederation was very weak, but intentionally so. You would never have to worry about a King George III if you never gave the government enough power to create a king. Our first government, though, had only one branch, Congress. Our first government had no ability to tax or raise an army. It wasn't easy to get anything done. The Articles themselves were very inflexible. All 13 states had to agree to change the Articles. And with the differences between the colonies, this would be nearly impossible. The good that would come out of the Articles of Confederation included 2 long-lasting laws. The Northwest Ordinance, which would determine how new territories could become states, and the Land Ordinance set aside land for public education. But, unfortunately, many more problems than good would come out of the Articles of Confederation. Major problems included the most notorious, which was Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was a series of violent attacks on courthouses and other government properties in Massachusetts, one of the new states. There was fear that Massachusetts alone wouldn't be able to put down the rebellion, and there was a growing fear of uncontrollable uprisings that could potentially destroy our entire country. The country was just too weak to unite, even in times of conflict. So, Shays' Rebellion, which was ultimately put down, but because of the fear of Shays' Rebellion, it became the #1 reason for a move to a new constitution. The U.S. needed a strong enough government to be able to provide for basic security. So Roman numeral 13 is the Constitution. The new Constitution will be called, yes, you got it right, the Constitution. It's what we have today. Leaders from the states decided to meet again with the intention to revise the Articles of Confederation. However, not enough states showed up to have a unanimous decision. Therefore, this meeting was in secret. The new constitution that would be created would create a stronger government, but it would split power into 3 different distinct branches. The hope was this, that if power is divided, it would be harder for the government to ever become tyrannical. most assumed that Congress would be the most powerful of the three branches. Because of this, all the states wanted to make sure that they had a powerful voice in Congress. The states, however, couldn't figure out how representation would be determined. How do we know how many representatives each state will get? Well, the large states felt like they should have more, since they had more people. But the small states argued that every state should get the same amount of representatives in Congress. This very issue alone threatened to spoil any hopes of a new constitution. Ultimately, the states compromised, splitting Congress into two. One side of Congress is based on population. It's known as the House of Representatives. And the other side of Congress, every state gets 2 representatives, no matter how large the state is. This side is known as the Senate. This compromise was referred to as the Great Compromise, and it is how our Congress works even to this day. Well, what about slaves? Southern states suggested that slaves be counted towards their population, because if they were counted, then southern state populations would be even larger, and that means they would get more representation in Congress. But northern states felt like this wouldn't be quite fair. Their logic was that since slaves are not treated like people, they should not be counted as people. To solve this problem, the 3/5 compromise stated that slaves would be counted, but only as 3/5 of a person. So, when the states were counting their population, they could factor in slaves, but not as full humans. Obviously, this is problematic in a lot of ways. A special committee also worked out another important compromise. We'll have 3 important compromises that you need to know. They agreed that Congress could eventually have the power to ban the slave trade, but not until much later, until the year 1800. This would be known as the Slave Trade Compromise, and it will come up again in another period. Once the Constitutional Convention ended, the document was ready for approval from the states. The delegates agreed that only 9 out of the 13 states would be needed for approval, and New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, and it became the law of the land. However, not everyone supported the Constitution. Anti-Federalists opposed the new Constitution because they worried that it did not include a Bill of Rights to protect basic freedoms like freedom of speech or freedom of religion. Federalists, however, were very much in favor of the new Constitution and believed a stronger government was needed. Roman numeral 14, Hamilton's economic plan. George Washington, the leader of the Continental Army, was elected the first president of the United States under the new Constitution. However, early on, it was quite clear that our country was facing severe economic problems that could tear us apart. The states had racked up massive debt, and some states were still relying on their own currency rather than a national currency. So Alexander Hamilton was chosen as Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, and it was his job to try to come up with a sustainable economic plan that would guide our nation's economy. His ultimate plan consisted of 3 parts. Part 1 was to assume all of the state's debts and pay it off. Then to implement taxes to bring in national revenue. And finally, to create a national bank to ensure a sustainable national currency. However, Hamilton faced considerable opposition to his plan, especially from southern states. Southern states were opposed to Hamilton's plan because for the most part, they had no debt or had already paid off their debt, and they did not like the idea of taking on more to help another state. So to ensure the success of his plan, Hamilton worked out a deal that would get the Southern states on board and approve this plan. The deal is this: the U.S. capital, the new capital of the United States, would be centered in the South, and it was placed in Washington, D.C., where it is today, and that got the Southern states to get on board with Hamilton's economic plan. Now it was apparent that the national government was certainly more assertive and taking on much more powerful role under the new Constitution. Not everyone agreed to this. In class, we listened to Hamilton's cabinet rap battle as you hear the differing opinions about how the new government will move forward. Roman numeral 15, the Whiskey Rebellion. These new taxes didn't come without opposition either. As soon as the government imposed new taxes, there was resistance. The protests were focused primarily on the tax on whiskey. Frontier farmers began to protest and refused to pay the new tax. However, this new government under the Constitution would take direct action. 15,000 troops were brought in to put down this rebellion, and the president himself, George Washington, rode in with these troops. The government was ready to show its strong arm under the new Constitution. So if Shays' Rebellion showed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, the Whiskey Rebellion would prove the strength of the national government under the Constitution. The farmers ultimately relented and paid the tax, and President Washington came out on top. Roman numeral 16, political parties. Another major development under the Washington presidency is the birth of political parties. Political parties are not mentioned in the Constitution, but they naturally formed due to differing opinions. Much of it stemmed from the divisions in Washington's cabinet itself. Two of his cabinet leaders hated each other and disagreed on every major issue, and that was Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. The Democratic-Republican Party were the followers of Thomas Jefferson. They strongly believed that most power should remain with the states, this idea of states' rights. The Federalist was the opposing party, and they were followers of the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and they preferred a strong national government. In class, we discussed the major issues that divided these two political parties. Make sure you go back and study this chart because it has some important details about the two political parties that you will need to know. Here are the pictures of the two political rivals, Alexander Hamilton, the founder of the Federalist Party, and Thomas Jefferson, the founder of the Democratic-Republican Party. One of the biggest disagreements between the two parties had to do with the French Revolution. During the Revolutionary War, an alliance was made between King Louis XVI and the United States. After our war for independence, Frenchmen began to fight for similar freedoms that we had fought for during the Revolutionary War. French monarchs, like the English King George III, were out of touch with the people of France. They cared little of the poverty and suffering of the common man. The famous line from Queen Marie Antoinette, "Let them eat cake," may or may not have actually been said, but it wouldn't have been far from the truth based on the monarch's disconnect with the poverty of the average French citizen. During the Reign of Terror, during the French Revolution, the French people took to the streets, attacking anyone and everyone associated with wealth, royalty, and religion. They took their fight for freedom to an extreme that we had not during the American Revolution. During this time, the King and Queen of France were executed by guillotine. But surprising to many French citizens, President George Washington decided to issue a proclamation of neutrality, stating that the United States would not get involved. He argued that he had never made an alliance with the people of France, but with the King of France. And since the King of France was now decapitated, the agreement was null and void. We had no obligation to help the French people. Because of this, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson resigns from George Washington's cabinet in protest. And we looked in class at Cabinet Battle number 2, which talks a little bit about this disagreement. But other countries other than France would be inspired by the U.S. fight for independence, including Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. Here shows you, during the Reign of Terror, the storming of the Bastille, which was a famous French prison. Here's a picture of the guillotine. It's estimated that 18,000 to 40,000 people were executed with the guillotine during the French Revolution. Here shows you King Louis about to experience his death on the guillotine. Roman numeral 17 is new problems. As a new country establishing ourselves on the world stage, it proved not to be an easy task. Besides the French Revolution, President George Washington had many other issues to deal with. As the United States attempted to establish itself at sea, for instance, the British continued to intercept U.S. merchant ships. Often American cargo was stolen or damaged during these encounters. To make matters worse, the British would also use impressments to literally take American sailors from their ships. Impressment of sailors was the practice of British officers boarding American ships, inspecting the crew, and taking sailors accused of being deserters from British ships. Often, however, they were not actually British deserters, and they were taken against their will. To settle the conflict, President George Washington sent John Jay to England to negotiate a treaty. Jay's treaty was a notable foreign policy agreement and impressive in what was agreed to. But unfortunately, Jay's treaty did not even mention trade interference or impressments, the main source of conflict. Instead, the British did agree to finally withdraw the remaining soldiers still stationed in America following the Revolutionary War. So, there was a lot that Jay's treaty did, but on top of what it didn't do, Jay's treaty actually angered the French, who saw it as a deal that the U.S. made with their enemy. This further divided the already damaged relationship between the U.S. and France. However, President Washington was able to establish some respect in regards to foreign policy. In Pinckney's treaty with Spain, the U.S. was granted use of the lower Mississippi River and port of New Orleans. George Washington had the opportunity to run for a third term as president, because there was no limits to that. But Washington decided to step aside. This act of humility set a precedent for future presidents to only serve a max of 2 terms. In his farewell address, Washington gave America a few warnings. He warned against political divisions. He was fearful that this growing political parties could divide Americans. That sounds kind of familiar today, doesn't it? He also warned against foreign affairs. He encouraged Americans to be careful about getting entangled in foreign affairs. Ouch, that kind of hurts. And finally, he warned against debt. He warned against what he said, ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. America could learn a few things by going back and reading Washington's words of warning: political divisions, foreign entanglements, and debt. Here's a couple more stimulus-based multiple choice for you to go back and review. President John Adams would have big shoes to fill by becoming the second president of the U.S. behind old George Washington. Honestly, anyone coming behind Washington would have it tough. Adams entered a situation of conflict with France, of course, that he hoped to resolve by sending representatives over to Paris. Tensions were obviously, though, still high, because when the Americans arrived in Paris, they were told that negotiations would not happen until they paid a bribe. This incident is referred to as the XYZ affair. President Adams felt that the French were insulting us as a new nation, and his quote is, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute." The United States would not pay tribute or bribe just to talk. But this conflict, unfortunately, would turn from words to violent attacks at sea, known as the Quasi-War with France. Roman numeral 18, the Alien and Sedition Acts. Congress and President Adams decided to take strong steps in response to the French foreign threat. In many ways, this will be the lasting legacy of the Adams presidency, and not for the good. The Alien Act stated that an individual would have to reside in the United States for 14 years before even being eligible for citizenship. Not only that, suspicious people could be deported. The Sedition Act was even worse. It became a crime to speak or publish against the government. Wait, what? Yes, Americans were told to silence dissent. This would be used to silence President Adams' opponents. Under the terms of this law, over 20 Democratic Republican newspaper editors were arrested, and some were even imprisoned for speaking out against the president. Many saw this, and we watched in class a scene from the HBO John Adams series. I would encourage you, if you've not seen it, to go back and watch it. An incredible series. But to many, they saw this as a clear violation of the First Amendment of the United States, freedom of speech. That the president, the second president of the United States, was already in violation of the Constitution and our basic rights outlined therein. Because of this, Jefferson and Madison felt that the states needed to take actions against the central government. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they were resolutions against these new laws, the Alien and Sedition Acts. They argued for the compact theory. They believed that since the states created a central or national government, then the states must judge the national government. You see that struggle of power between the states and the national government? Well, keep it in mind, because that struggle will remain a trend throughout U.S. history. Well, these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions introduced an idea known as nullification, that states do not have to necessarily enforce laws that they disagree with. Adams will lose his re-election bid, and these laws will quickly be removed. But the idea of nullification, that states can say no to federal laws, will linger on throughout American history. Well, that brings us to the end of period 3. I know it was much longer than period 1 and 2, but I encourage you to go back, watch the video, read over your notes, read AMSCO, and you will be well prepared. I hope you have enjoyed the video, that you learned a lot. Be sure to come back for period 4. See you soon.